Alvin, in trying to discern whether or not God exists, I've been fascinated by looking at the characteristics of God, if he does exist, and to help us understand what is this being that we're wondering about. You have a very well-known concept that asks about the nature of God. How can we begin to think about God having a nature?
Well, there are two different directions one could go here. If God has a nature, if he really does have a nature, then there are certain things that he can't do. He can't, so to speak, go against his nature. So if it's part of God's nature to be omnipotent or omniscient, all-knowing, let's say, then it can't be that he should decide not to be omniscient and say, well, I'd rather just not know anything or not know very much. It's really, it's terribly wearing to have to know all these things and so on. So one way to think about this is whether God really does have a nature. If he doesn't have a nature, one reason for thinking God doesn't have a nature is the idea that God really has to be sovereign and has to have aseity, has to be independent of everything else, and he has to be sovereign. He has to be in total control. Well, if he's in total control, then he should be able to do anything. Even things that sound totally crazy, like, for example, God, you might say, somebody who thinks that way, Descartes, for example, might say, God could know that he doesn't exist. That's not the way things go, but he could have brought it about that he knows that he doesn't exist. Or God could have made it the case that 2 + 3 = 7 instead of equaling 5. And so there are sort of two contrary intuitions, you might say, two contrary lines of thought here. On the one hand, if you're a believer in God, you think God should be sovereign and should have aseity. You could call that the sovereignty aseity intuition. And if you take that really seriously, like Descartes did and some others, then you would say, well, God can't be limited by anything at all, and so he shouldn't be limited even by the laws of logic. And so he can, if he wanted to, well, he wouldn't want to, it'd be stupid to do it, create married bachelors, or make it the case that 2 + 3 = 7, or make it the case that he knows that he doesn't exist. And then on the other hand, there's the intuition that doesn't even make sense. It doesn't make sense to say that God should know that he doesn't exist. That can't be. That's just not even in any sense at all possible. And I guess the question is, which of these two intuitions is the stronger? If you're a serious theist, a serious believer in God, will you go with the sovereignty aseity intuition, or with the other intuition that there are some things that just can't happen in the strongest sense of can, and that not even God can make happen? I guess my own inclination is to go the second way, not the first way. It seems to me more obvious that it doesn't even make sense to suggest that God might know that he doesn't exist than it is to think that if God is sovereign and has aseity, then he's got to be able to even violate the laws of logic.
So then you're going to begin to categorize a series of things that God can't do or is limiting God.
Yeah, so I would say that God does have a nature, and it's of importance and interest to see what this nature consists in, what God really is like. And here I think it's important to think about God's being a perfect being, or God's being a being worthy of worship, somebody who is such that it makes sense, is right to worship him. Not just any great being is worthy of worship. Einstein was a mighty intellect, but not really worthy of worship. To be worthy of worship, what would a being have to be like? I think of such a being would have to be a best possible being, or a greatest possible being, one such that there couldn't be any being greater than it is. And so that's how I'm inclined to think of God. You might say that's thinking of God in an Anselmian way. Anselm produced this ontological argument many centuries ago. So God would have to be a greatest possible being. And the greatest possible being, I guess, would have to be one who is all-powerful and all-knowing and morally perfect, wholly good, and maybe other things as well. But not only would such a being have to have those properties, as a matter of fact, this being would have to be such that it couldn't fail to have these properties. So God would not just, as a matter of fact, be all-powerful, but would be all-powerful, would have been all-powerful no matter how anything else had turned out. Couldn't have failed to be all-powerful. Couldn't have failed to be omniscient, all-knowing. Couldn't have failed to be a God of love. Couldn't have failed to be perfectly good. So we would have these properties and have them essentially, you might say, or have them necessarily. And if God does have those properties necessarily, well, then there are certain things that not even he can do. He can't bring it about that he doesn't have them, for example. So he can't divest himself of his omnipotence or omniscience or goodness.
These characteristics that God has essentially are adjectives, they're terms, they describe things. So do those things become entities that exist prior to God? If God is omnipotent or omniscient and knows it, these are concepts. Do these concepts exist independent of God so that God is dependent upon them? We deal with the whole area of abstract objects, so-called Platonic forms, and infinite numbers of these.
Right, yeah. Well, I don't think it would be right to say that these things are concepts. I would say they are properties. So I would think of concepts as dependent on us human beings. We have concepts. If we didn't exist, then neither would our concepts. But if we didn't exist, there would still be properties. There would still be, say, trees, which would have the property of having trunks and branches and green leaves, etc. So, but I mean, I take your point. If there are all these properties in addition to God, then isn't God limited by them? I mean, so there will be, say, all the numbers. How many numbers are there? There's infinitely many natural numbers, and then there's uncountably many real numbers, and so on and so on. All the sets of numbers, let's say, and all the sets of other abstract objects like properties and propositions and states of affairs and possible worlds. Your question is, how do all those things relate to God? Have they always just been there, and did God, sort of speak, find himself surrounded by all this stuff, or what? Well, that's a good question. And I think the best answer to this question is one that goes back to Augustine. So Augustine lived in the 5th century or so, and in his intellectual context, Platonism was very important, the philosopher Plato. And Plato had talked about this, what he called this realm of ideas. These, or he also called them forms. So there are actual dogs running around, but there's also the form of doghood or dogity or cananinity or whatever. And these forms are arranged in a kind of hierarchy with a special form, the idea of the good at the very top and the like of that. So there are all those forms, which are really abstract objects. Augustine's idea was that those forms, those ideas are really ideas. They are ideas in the mind of God, so that they are, you might say, part of God. It's not then that these things exist independent of God. They really are, they are just part of God. The same would go for propositions. They would be divine thoughts. So the proposition, all men are mortal, that's not a human thought. Even if there weren't any people, that thought would still be there, but it's a divine thought. That's what propositions are. And so propositions have always existed since God has always existed, and they exist necessarily. God thinks these propositions, and it's part of his very nature to think them, and the like. In that way, it seems to me this sort of looming fear that God is just overwhelmed by all these other things that are distinct from him sort of disappears.
What does it mean to say that God is simple? This is an important theological topic that God has no parts, that each characteristic that God has, all powerful, all knowing, are sort of the same thing as Him, and it's all one.
Yeah, that goes back again to the ancient world, and it was developed in some detail by Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. You characterize it quite well. I mean, God has no parts. First of all, no material parts. Well, He's not a material object, so no material parts. That's pretty clear, no problem there. But second, there's no composition in God of any kind. So there's no composition of thing and property. We ordinarily think that you and I are things, and we've got properties. We've got the property of being here right now. We've got the property of being human beings, the property of knowing certain things, but we, of course, are not the same thing as those properties. Well, Aquinas suggested this in this classical doctrine that there isn't that kind of composition in God either. So God has to be identical with His properties. It seems to follow from that each of His properties has to be identical with each of His other properties, because if one thing A is identical with something B, then anything else identical with A is also identical with B. So omnipotence would have to be the same property as omniscience. That doesn't seem very straightforward.
You've called this a very dark saying.
It's a dark saying, very dark saying, right. And you might ask, well, no, why should you think a thing like that? Why should you think that there isn't this kind of composition in God? Aquinas seems to think that it's because if there were a distinction between God and His properties, then there are these two parts to God which could, so to speak, fall apart, and then God wouldn't exist. But God's a necessary being. It can't be that He doesn't exist. That's the way he thinks about it.
These different properties that God has, are all of them necessary, or only a few necessary, and some are just happen to be that way, contingent, as we say?
I would say the latter. Aquinas, again, wouldn't, but let's let him alone for the time being, let him go down his path and so on. I would say that God has many properties that He does not have essentially. You could say a property is essential to God or to any other thing if the thing in question couldn't have existed but lacked the property, or if it has that property in every possible world, then you could say it's essential to the being in question. But that's not the way it is with God. I mean, He has the property of having created human beings, but He didn't have to. It's not that He couldn't possibly have refrained from doing that. So that's a property He has contingently rather than essentially. Also, the whole Christian story of incarnation and atonement, it's not that God was obliged to find some way of atonement so that sinners, people who would turn their backs on Him, could be reconciled with Him. It's a matter of free choice on His part. So I would say God has many properties accidentally, or that makes it sound like just by accident, many properties contingently, but then also many properties essentially, like being omnipotent and omniscient and completely good, and a creator of whatever there is, and so on.
Can we, with confidence, divide the properties into those two categories, or can God be God and have some of those properties like omnipotence, omniscience, morally good, contingently? Might it have been possible for God to have some of those properties and not have some others?
Well, I don't think that He could have had those properties, omnipotence and omniscience, contingently. I mean, if in fact He has them essentially, then it's not possible that He should have had them non-essentially or contingently. So, I mean, I guess I would say those properties He has necessarily and couldn't have lacked or couldn't have had contingently. But if He does have the property of being the creator of whatever there is, so that in every possible world, whatever there is besides God is created by God, then it seems to me it follows that he has some properties accidentally or contingently. For example, having created us human beings. If that property weren't contingent to God, then we would be necessary beings too, you know? And it seems pretty obvious that we're not.